The scar on Jorge's side still throbbed when it rained, a permanent reminder the night he woke up on a blood-stained operating table in a basement clinic, missing more than just his innocence. 3 years had passed since that horror, but the 18-year-old boy who trusted a kind stranger's offer free passage to America had died in that underground room. What survived was something harder, angrier, and determined to make sure no other desperate teenager would fall for the same deadly kindness. The video confession Jorge recorded would eventually save dozens of lives, but the price of that knowledge had been written in his own flesh and paid with his own blood. As he adjusted the camera in his small apartment, preparing to tell the world about organ trafficking networks that preyed on migrants, the surgical scars served as credentials, proof that some borders were crossed not with documents or coyotes, but with scalpels wielded by predators who understood that desperation made the perfect anesthesia. It had started in Tijuana, where 18-year-old Jorge had been stranded for 3 weeks with empty pockets and fading hope. His family in Guatemala had scraped together enough money to get him to the border, but not enough for a coyote. He'd been sleeping in shelters, doing odd jobs for food, watching other migrants disappear into the night with guides he couldn't afford. Every day brought new stories of successful crossings, but none of those stories were within his financial reach. That's when he met Elena, though he'd later learned that wasn't her real name. She approached him at a migrant resource center, a well-dressed woman in her 40s who spoke with the authority of someone who understood the system. She claimed to work with a humanitarian organization that helped young migrants reach their families in America. Her business cards looked professional, her English was perfect, and her offer seemed too good to be true. Free passage to Los Angeles. No payment required up front. The organization, she explained, was funded by successful immigrants who remembered their own struggles. All Jorge needed to do was undergo a basic medical examination to ensure he was healthy enough for the journey. She'd arrange everything: transportation, documents, even a place to stay once he reached California. It was exactly what he'd been praying for. Elena's house in a middle-class Tijuana neighborhood reinforced her legitimacy. Clean, comfortable, filled with photos of smiling families, she claimed to have helped cross safely. She served him a home-cooked meal, the first he'd enjoyed in weeks, while explaining the process. The medical exam was necessary because the organization's insurance required health screening, a simple blood test, basic physical, nothing invasive. Then they began arranging his crossing. The other young men staying at Elena's house seemed to confirm her story. There was Carlos from Honduras, waiting for his final paperwork. Miguel from El Salvador, scheduled to cross the following week. Both spoke gratefully about Elena's generosity, about the organization's professionalism. They'd been medically cleared and were just waiting for optimal crossing conditions. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their gratitude genuine. Jorge's medical appointment was scheduled at Clinic Across Town, a modern facility that looked far more professional than the back-alley operations he'd expected. The doctor who examined him was American, spoke fluent Spanish, and seemed genuinely concerned about Jorge's health and welfare. The blood tests were routine, the physical examination thorough, but appropriate. Everything felt legitimate, regulated, safe. The results, Elena explained 2 days later, showed Jorge was in excellent health, perfect candidate for their program. However, there was one additional requirement she'd forgotten to mention. The organization's primary sponsor was a wealthy American businessman who needed a kidney transplant himself. As a condition of his funding, he required all sponsored migrants to undergo compatibility testing. Just a precaution, Elena assured him, very few people were compatible matches anyway. The compatibility test required another blood draw, more extensive than the first. Jorge hesitated, some instinct warning him that this was unusual. But Elena's explanation made sense. Wealthy donors often had specific requirements for their charity. And what choice did he have? He'd been in Tijuana for weeks. His money was gone, and winter was coming. This was his only option for reaching America before the weather made crossing impossible. The results came back positive. Jorge was incredibly a perfect match for the sponsor's needs. Elena seemed almost surprised by the news, explaining that such compatibility was rare, perhaps 1 in thousands. But this meant Jorge's crossing would be expedited, given priority status. The sponsor was so grateful for potential match that he was personally funding Jorge's entire journey, including job placement in Los Angeles. There was, however, one request. The sponsor hoped Jorge might consider donation. Not required, Elena emphasized, but would be a life-saving gift that would also ensure Jorge's permanent status in America. The sponsor had connections with immigration attorneys, could arrange documentation that would make Jorge's status completely legal. It was an opportunity beyond anything Jorge had imagined. The donation procedure would be performed at a state-of-the-art medical facility. Elena assured him, American standards, full recovery support, no risks to Jorge's health. He'd wake up a hero who'd saved a life and secured his own future simultaneously. The surgery was scheduled for following week, giving him time to consider the decision carefully. Jorge's instincts screamed warnings, but desperation drowned out caution. He was 18, alone, broke, and facing winter in a border town with no prospects. Elena had shown him photos of other young donors living successful lives in America, grateful for the opportunity they'd been given. The medical facilities looked professional. The paperwork seemed legitimate, and the alternative was returning to Guatemala with nothing but shame. The night before the surgery, Elena prepared a special dinner to celebrate Jorge's decision. She spoke emotionally about the lives he was saving. Not just a recipient, but his own family who would benefit from his success in America. The wine she served was expensive, a toast to his courage and generosity. Jorge felt proud, noble, chosen for something greater than a simple border crossing. He woke up in hell. The room was nothing like the medical facility Elena had shown him in photographs. It was a basement, concrete walls sweating moisture, medical equipment that looked salvaged rather than sterile. His side screamed with pain, and when he tried to move, restraints held him to the table. The surgical site was bandaged with supplies that looked more appropriate for veterinary use than human medicine. A man in scrubs who definitely wasn't the American doctor from the clinic stood nearby, speaking rapid Spanish into a phone about complications and recovery time. When he noticed Jorge was conscious, he administered an injection that made the world fade around the edges, but not enough to stop Jorge from understanding what had happened to him. Elena appeared eventually, but gone was a caring humanitarian who'd offered him dinner and hope. This version was businesslike, cold, discussing Jorge's recovery as if he were inventory rather than a human being. She explained the situation with the same professional tone she'd used to describe the donation process. His kidney was already gone, harvested hours ago. The recipient was recovering well in a proper hospital elsewhere in the city. Jorge's value to the organization had been his youth, his health, and his desperation. Young migrants made perfect donors. They were healthy, had no family nearby to ask questions, and were unlikely to report crimes to authorities who might deport them. The medical screening had been legitimate, designed to ensure organ quality. Everything else had been theater designed to gain his consent. The recovery room was a concrete cell, shared with two other young men in various stages of post-surgical healing. One had been there for weeks, his surgical site infected, speaking deliriously about the American University scholarship he'd been promised in exchange for his kidney. The other was newer, still processing the reality of his situation, crying for a mother he'd probably never see again. Jorge learned the organization's business model from these cellmates. They targeted teenage migrants with compelling sob stories and promises of free passage to America. The medical screenings identified valuable organs, kidneys, liver lobes, corneas, even skin grafts. Compatible donors were given priority treatment, pampered until surgery day, then discarded to recover in basement cells or shallow graves, depending on their post-operative condition. Elena ran one of several similar operations in Tijuana, each targeting different demographics of migrants. Teenage boys were preferred for kidneys, young, healthy, and unlikely to be missed quickly. Young women were often trafficked for different purposes before organ harvest. Older migrants were used for less valuable organs or as test subjects for surgical techniques. Everyone was inventory in a market that treated human suffering as a renewable resource. Escape became Jorge's obsession, but his physical condition made planning difficult. The surgery had been performed competently enough to keep him alive, but without concern for his long-term health. The incision was healing poorly, probably infected, and his energy levels remained dangerously low. The other prisoners warned him about failed escape attempts, pointing to a corner where bloodstains marked someone's final bid for freedom. The opportunity came during a shift change when guard became careless about the basement door. Jorge had been feigning unconsciousness, conserving energy for a moment when security was minimal. When he heard the guards discussing a new arrival, their attention focused on processing fresh inventory. He forced himself off the recovery table and stumbled toward the stairs. The house above the basement clinic was Elena's legitimate residence, the same place where she'd served him dinner and spoken about saving lives. The irony was devastating. He was escaping through rooms where he'd been seduced into donating his organs. The family photos he thought showed rescue migrants were actually before and after pictures of organ donors, trophy shots of successful harvests. Getting out of the house was easier than staying free. Jorge was weak, barely able to walk, still wearing hospital scrubs that marked him as either an escaped patient or a victim of something worse. His surgical site bled through the bandages, and every step sent waves of pain through his damaged body. But terror provided energy that his healing body couldn't, and he forced himself to keep moving through Tijuana's darkened streets. The police station seemed like salvation, but Jorge quickly learned that law enforcement's relationship with the organ trade was complicated. Some officers were genuinely horrified by his story and eager to investigate. Others seemed unsurprised, asking pointed questions about what he'd expected when accepting free medical care from strangers. The investigation that followed was perfunctory, hindered by Jorge's illegal immigration status and Elena's apparent connections with local officials. Medical treatment at a legitimate hospital revealed the full extent of the damage. The kidney removal had been performed competently, but the aftercare had been criminally negligent. Infection had spread through his abdomen, requiring additional surgery to clean dead tissue. His remaining kidney showed signs of damage from the trauma, meaning he'd need medical monitoring for life. The psychological wounds were deeper and would take longer to heal. Elena and her organization had vanished by the time police raided the house. The basement clinic had been stripped of equipment, cleaned of evidence, and abandoned. The other victims Jorge had shared the recovery room were gone, rescued, relocated, or worse. The investigation hit dead ends at every turn, stymied by a network that clearly had experience evading law enforcement. Jorge's recovery took months, complicated by his legal status and financial situation. Humanitarian organizations provided medical support, but his immigration case remained complex. He'd entered Mexico legally but couldn't prove his intended destination or the crimes committed against him. The missing kidney was evidence of something, but proving organ trafficking without arrests or convictions was nearly impossible. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical trauma. Jorge had trusted completely, believed Elena's promises about saving lives and securing his future. The betrayal cut deeper than the surgeon's scalpel, leaving him unable to trust offers of help from anyone. Paranoia became a survival mechanism, protecting him from future exploitation, but isolating him from legitimate assistance. Returning to Guatemala wasn't an option. His family had invested everything in his journey north, borrowed money they couldn't repay, mortgaged their future on his American success. How could he explain that their sacrifice had bought nothing but a surgical scar and traumatic memories? Better to remain in Mexico, struggling with one kidney, than face the shame of failure and the debt collectors who'd target his family. Work was difficult with his physical limitations and psychological trauma. Jorge found employment in warehouses and construction sites, jobs that didn't require background checks or questions about medical history. But his stamina was limited, his strength reduced, and his earning potential permanently compromised. The kidney he'd lost had been worth thousands to Elena's organization, but left him with a lifetime of reduced capacity. The nightmares were specific and medical. Jorge would dream of waking up on operating tables, of finding new incisions on his body, of discovering that more organs had been harvested while he slept. He'd check his surgical scar obsessively, feeling for new wounds, convinced that the organ trafficking network was still hunting him. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford, vigilance his constant companion. Other survivors of Elena's organization found Jorge through the informal networks that connected trafficking victims. Their stories were variations on his theme, Promises of free passage, medical screenings, and surgical harvests. Some had lost kidneys, others liver lobes. A few had been used for multiple procedures. All carried the same scars, physical and psychological, of trusting predators who understood that desperation made people vulnerable to any offer of hope. The decision to record a confession came after learning that Elena's organization was still operating, still targeting teenage migrants, still harvesting organs from the desperate. Jorge had seen missing person flyers for boys who matched the profile he'd fit 3 years earlier. Young, healthy, alone, perfect candidates for the kind of medical screening that had cost him his kidney and nearly his life. Recording the video required Jorge to relive every detail of his experience, to describe Elena's methods, to warn potential victims about the warning signs he'd ignored. The process was emotionally devastating but necessary. He spoke directly to the camera, showing his surgical scar, naming Elena and describing her operation in detail. The video was his testimony and his weapon against a network that had victimized him. The confession went viral within days of being posted online. Jorge's story resonated with migrants who'd received similar offers, with families whose children had disappeared after promised medical care, with law enforcement agencies investigating organ trafficking networks. The video provided details that helped identify other operations, rescue other victims, and arrest some of the predators who'd been operating with impunity. Elena was eventually arrested in a raid that rescued 6 teenage boys from her current operation. Jorge's video had provided the evidence needed for warrants, the details required for prosecution. Seeing her in handcuffs on television news didn't restore his kidney or heal his trauma, but it felt like a form of justice for the 18-year-old boy who trusted her promises of help. The trial revealed the full scope of Elena's organization. Dozens of victims, hundreds of harvested organs, millions of dollars in profits from human suffering. Jorge testified via video link. His surgical scar displayed as evidence, his story corroborating other victims' accounts. Elena showed no remorse, treating the proceedings as a business dispute rather than acknowledgement of the lives she destroyed. Jorge's video had inspired other trafficking survivors to speak out, creating a movement that made organ trafficking harder to ignore. His scar became a symbol of survival rather than victimization, proof that predators could be exposed and stopped. The confession that had cost him so much to record had become a tool for protecting others from similar exploitation. But the medical reality remained unchanged. Jorge still lived with 1 kidney, still required regular monitoring, still faced the long-term health consequences of trusting a stranger's promise of free passage to America. His body would never fully recover from Elena's betrayal, but his spirit had found purpose in preventing others from suffering the same fate. The organ trafficking networks adapted to increase scrutiny, move operations, change tactics. But Jorge's video remained online, a permanent warning to potential victims about the predators who offered free passage in exchange for parts of their bodies. Every view, every share, every comment from someone who'd been saved by his story justified the pain of reliving his trauma. 5 years after losing his kidney, Jorge worked as an advocate for trafficking victims, using his experience to educate migrants about the warning signs of organ harvesting operations. His speaking engagements at shelters and community centers always began the same way, by showing a scar and explaining that some offers of help came with surgical strings attached. The American dream he'd sought at 18 had evolved into something different, but perhaps more meaningful. Instead of crossing borders to build a better life for himself, he'd become a guardian for others making the same desperate journey. His kidney was gone forever, harvested by predators who turned his hope into their profit. But his voice remained, stronger for having survived Elena's knife, committed to ensuring that no other 18-year-old would wake up on a blood-stained table wondering what parts of their body had been stolen while they dreamed of freedom. The scar still throbbed when it rained, but it had become a reminder of survival rather than loss, of resistance rather than victimization. Jorge carried it like a badge of honor earned in a war most people didn't know was being fought, a conflict where the battlefield was a human body, and the prize was the desperation of those who'd risk anything for a chance at something better. Elena remained in prison, her organization dismantled, her victims finally acknowledged and protected. But somewhere in Tijuana or Juarez or another border city, new predators were approaching new, desperate teenagers with promises of free passage and medical care. Jorge's confession continued to circulate online, a digital antibody against the virus of exploitation, warning the vulnerable about kindness that came with scalpels and promises that required organs as payment. The 18-year-old boy who trusted Elena was gone, sacrificed on an operating table in a basement clinic. What remained was something harder and wiser, scarred by experience but strengthened by survival, determined to protect others from the predators who understood that in the mathematics of desperation, even kidneys could become currency for passage to dreams that would never come true.